Good morning, everyone. I'm Martha Zavala, president of the League of Women Voters, Pasadena area. Welcome to Thursday with the League, Crisis at the Border. What is it really about? What can the League of Women Voters do? Before we get to our program, let's take a moment to acknowledge National Women's History Month. Posted on our website is a list of 12 books all about the women who dared, politicians, daredevils, athletes, and musicians. The women in these books blazed their own trails. This is a wonderful list that was shared with us by the Arcadia Library, and it's a great way to celebrate the many contributions women have made to enrich our personal and public lives. Share it with your daughters, your sisters, your mothers. They're really wonderful stories about people you really, some of them about people you rarely hear about. Today, we're very eager to present a timely and relevant, important program about the humanitarian crisis at our border. You may know that as reported in November 2022, more than 60% of the migrants encountered at our southern border are from countries other than Mexico and the Northern Triangle region. Our speakers today, Dr. Susan Martin, Steering Committee of the LWV Immigration Interest Group, and Esmeralda Flores, Southern Region Policy Manager, CHIRLA, will speak to us about the current developments at our southern border and about immigration rights. And now, let me turn the meeting over to Karen Robertson, our president-elect and member of the Immigration Committee. She will introduce our speakers and say a few words about the committee. Karen, good morning.
Thank you, Martha, and good morning, everyone. We're glad that you could join us today. I am interested in immigration. I've been part of the Immigration Committee for the League of Women Voters Pasadena area for some time. I just wanted to reiterate some of what Martha said. In 2006, the League of Women Voters National voted to undertake a study on immigration. And after study and consensus, they finalized a policy position in 2008 and sent it to the members of Congress. So between that 2008 and now, the League has lobbied for or opposed various legislative actions related to different aspects of immigration policy. Our main interest is the humane treatment of immigrants and migrants to our country. At the last national conference, a League of Women Voters U.S. Immigration Interest Group was formed, and the Pasadena League, along with San Diego League, were key proponents of the caucus and the recommendations in the resolution to more aggressively pursue immigration reform with the current administration. So just with that little background, I wanted to let you know that we are pleased and very excited to present two great speakers. Dr. Susan Martin is the Donald G. Herzberg Professor Emerita of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She was the founder and director of Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration, and she is currently advising the World Bank International Organization for Migration and the UN Network on Migration on issues related to climate change and human mobility. Prior to joining Georgetown's faculty, Dr. Martin was the executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, which was mandated by statute to advise the President and Congress on U.S. immigration and refugee policy. The most recent book publication of hers is entitled A Nation of Immigrants, second edition. As Martha mentioned, Dr. Martin serves as president of the League of Women Voters of the San Juan Islands, Washington, and is a member of the steering committee of the League of Women Voters Immigration Interest Group that I previously mentioned. Dr. Martin will be our first speaker, and we then will introduce Esmeralda Flores as our second speaker. So take it away, Dr. Martin.
But thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be specifically talking about the threats to asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border as part of the humanitarian emergency that has evolved there. It's an important part because many of those who are caught up in enforcement at the border would normally be asylum seekers coming from countries in which their lives are threatened. Okay, this is also not allowing me to, there we go. I'm going to start though with some information more generally about what's happening in the world today. And I don't think, okay, on the global situation. The number of forcibly displaced people around the world has reached 100 million. That's what the highest it's ever been. It includes a variety of people, including the largest group are still within their country, but are displaced from their homes. Then the next largest are people who are refugees, meaning they're outside of their country of origin, and they're under the mandate of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Then come Palestinian refugees, and they're a separate group because of the language of that it was adopted by the UN in 1948, which established them as a separate group of people to be whose situation needs to be addressed. We then have asylum seekers, and those are the people who are seeking to be recognized as refugees. And the UN considers the people displaced from Venezuela to not necessarily be refugees, but they're people of such concern to the international community that they're considered in this quasi-refugee, quasi-migrant status and are separately determined. There are a number of reasons to curb irregular migration through borders, whether it's our borders with Mexico, Canada, and borders all over the world. And this can be in terms of both land borders, which is gaining the most attention right now, or we can be talking about people coming in with boats. And the US has seen this with Cuban boat lifts, Haitian boat lifts, and others using boats and rafts to get into the country. The reasons to curb it, and I think these are serious ones that in thinking about how to deal with the crisis of the border, we really need to take into account. First of all, there is an undermining of the rule of law when people are coming through and transiting from one country to another without authorization and then attempting to get to their final destination. Smuggling and trafficking groups flourish, and there's a general undermining of the rule of law in these kinds of contexts, because usually it doesn't happen unless there's a lot of graft and corruption in order for the smugglers and the traffickers to be able to work. It also undermines support for legal immigration systems and humane asylum policies when it's seen that people are not going through the queue if there is one, and are coming in on their own terms rather than through what is seen to be the legal immigration system in place. And therefore, when the legal immigration system doesn't work, it's a two-way process in which irregular migration undermines the legal system. The legal system supports the need for irregular mechanisms to reach places of safety. It also puts pressure on border communities. Many of them are the poorest in the country and may not necessarily have the resources to deal with large-scale movements. And perhaps most importantly, it presents a real human toll on the migrants themselves. It's difficult for them to maintain contacts with their families because they can't come and go as they please. They don't have rights in this destination country. And so therefore it's much more difficult for them to escape from situations in which they're either being oppressed or even in physical danger. And migrating clandestinely is dangerous in itself, as we've seen in the pathways from South America up through to the United States. And speaking of the dangers, some of the more recent statistics are showing that the numbers of people who die during an attempt to move from one location to another are quite significant. And therefore, just saying, well, people should be able to come is right on the one side, but it misses the fact that there are problems with having irregular migration as the major means of access to asylum and other forms of protection. So there's a great need for balancing border and human security. By the way, I have a lot of material in these slides, and we'll be making the slides available to everyone because I don't have time to talk about it. But when we're talking about border security and how to balance it with human security, we have to take into account that both international law and also domestic US law make an exception, many exceptions in border enforcement for those who are refugees or determined through an asylum process to be refugees, and those who are at risk of torture. And this is called a principle. The principle is called non-refoulement, non-forcible return, that contracting states in the UN law and the US, in terms of its own law, will not return people who are would be endangered in the countries from which they fled. And so asylum is very different from other mechanisms. It's something where we have a process in which people can ask to remain in a safe spot and not be forced to return home. But that system is completely broken today. The current legislation framework is based on the Refugee Act of 1980. It created a universal definition of a refugee, which I have on the slide. You have to have a well-founded fear of persecution, and it has to be on the basis of specific characteristics: your race, religion, your nationality, membership in a particular social group that is under threat of persecution, or your political opinion. And what's left out of this is a fear of generalized violence, even if it rises to the level of conflict. So many of the people who apply for asylum are rejected not because there is a lack of danger for them, but because they can't meet this quite narrow definition of who is a refugee. The Refugee Act also created a refugee resettlement admissions process, which has both a regular process, but also emergency mechanisms if a new conflict or a new set of repression breaks out mid-year. And it allows the number of people to come in to be variable. It's the best way for people who have a threat to their lives to enter, but that process has been broken as well, particularly under the Trump administration, but it's continuing not to function as it should be, and we're admitting many, many fewer refugees through that process than has been allowed under the annual consultations. It fights for funding for organizations that can help asylum seekers and refugees get the aid that they need when they first arrive. And there are specific policies on asylum. And those, though, are really just 2 paragraphs in the entire Refugee Act. So there's a lot of discretion. There have also been subsequent laws passed. The Immigration Act of 1990 provided temporary protected status. It doesn't, it's for people who are or can't return home because of conflict or because of natural disasters in their home countries. But it doesn't deal with entry. It only pertains to people already in the US. There is also, on the negative side, there was put in place a process for expedited removal and of people through administrative processes at the border and much less of the protections that would occur if you were already inside the country. And then some of the anti-terrorism acts toughened asylum and admissions processes and made it easier to deport on the basis of terrorist or criminal grounds. There have also been a lot of administrative reforms to the asylum systems. There's now, since 1991, there's been a separate corps of asylum officers, but there have never been enough ones to hear all of the cases that need to be adjudicated. In 1994, there was a set of reforms to address a growing backlog in asylum cases, and that turned out to be pretty effective as a way of dealing with the problems that were being accounted. And it included the idea that you would separate work permits from the asylum process, do an adjudication, first adjudication within 90 days and a second within 6 months before, and have a quick answer for people. And the effect of these reforms was that asylum applications were reduced by half and asylum approvals doubled because the cases were were much stronger ones because it wasn't just people who were looking for a work permit rather than needing to be protected. It came about because of very close consultation between the government, and I was director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform at the time, so I was involved in these consultations. But we spent a lot of time talking with people who worked with asylum seekers and refugees and on various different other migration issues that were relevant. And what came up was a plan that everybody agreed to. So there was no litigation, and it was implemented and carried out, I think, in a very, very good fashion. Now, the expedited removal process was originally conceived to address large-scale migration emergencies at the border, and it the 1996 Immigration Act, though, broadened the scope of it to everyone who was crossing without authorization at the US border. It's a very time-consuming process to go through, and at the end of the day, all that you have for most people has been an ability to get into the country to claim asylum. Even if the asylum officer who's interviewing at the border thinks their case is very strong and would likely grant asylum. So it's a process which is highly backlogged and backlogs all of the rest of the asylum process. In the Obama and Trump administrations, we saw a large increase in unaccompanied minors and families, at first primarily from Central America, now from countries that we're seeing all over the world. In the Obama administration, it's the first time we started talking about humanitarian emergencies at the border in the way in which children and families were being addressed. This asylum backlogs began growing and continued. But one of the key parts of the Obama plan was to have a Central American minors humanitarian parole program instituted within Central America to give kids with some ties to people in the US a chance to come in through a legal process. The Trump administration forgot all about all of those and willingly put in place very inhumane policies. And I won't go into details on them because I think many people here already know what happened. Let me say the asylum process, part of the problem is that it is so complicated. There are three different types. The affirmative asylum process for people already in the country, a process for arriving asylum seekers at the border, and then a defensive asylum process for those who are apprehended and would otherwise be found to be deportable. And one of the results of this has been this terrible growth in the backlog. Where in cases it's way above 600,000, in people it's way above 1.5 million people who are requesting asylum who are sitting in this backlog and taking up time and resources. By the way, the 1994 reform had an agreement from Congress that they would put in place once the process got, the new asylum system was put into place for legislatively adjusting the status of people who had been waiting for 10, 15 years to get to their asylum application. And the decisions, as I said, it's very difficult to show that you're an asylum seeker. So only less than 40% of the people who apply for asylum are actually granted it at any given time. And some people get other forms of relief, but it's not a perfect system for dealing with the threat to people in their home country. The Biden administration, and I'll leave it to Esme to talk much more about that, retained a number of Trump policies and have recently established some new proposed programs that would increase humanitarian parole, increase the number of people who would be sent in an orderly way back to Mexico, and also to end the Title 42 bars, but with a lot of problems in this set of reforms that I think are not legitimate. Humanitarian parole, which I've mentioned a number of times, had been the default method for refugee admissions before 1980. For 1980 until the Obama administration, it was used sporadically for admission of people who would otherwise be coming in through the refugee admission status. But now it's in use for admissions of thousands of people, Central America, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, etc. The problem is it's much harder to have family reunification because there's no specific process for doing that, limited access to refugee services, and no pathway to permanent residence or citizenship unless the applicants can apply for asylum and meet that standard. And so people are in limbo. There are a lot of benefits to resettlement as an alternative to parole. I'm almost out of time, so I'm not going to go through these in any detail. Be happy to answer questions. But let me end with what can the League do? We certainly can advocate for protection of refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs. And that should be advocacy for people who are still in a country of first asylum, which is usually a poor country that borders their countries. The Ukrainian situation is quite different, but in most cases, we're seeing refugees and internally displaced persons in Africa, in South Asia, places where there's poverty, conflict, environmental damage, etc. We can advocate an end to barriers to asylum at the border and in the interior. And we'll keep talking about that, and certainly in the next presentation. We need to continue to educate ourselves as members of the League, as well as others, about these border and asylum issues. I think the interest group is a great first step in that. I think we can and will be doing more in the way of education. We need always to collaborate with other organizations concerned with current border policies and have a strong list of partnership organizations. We need to support reforms in asylum that include very specific things, reducing the backlog, which means increasing the number of people who are adjudicating those cases, but also figuring out reforms as we did in 1994. That would be legislative reforms to provide an alternative legal status to people who've been waiting for a certain period of time. Since many of the claims that we're hearing today relate to domestic and gang violence, particularly from Central America, but from all of the places that asylum seekers are coming from, we need to ensure access to asylum for those individuals and provide access to legal representation for asylum seekers. Those are two areas of advocacy that I think the League is particularly well suited to weigh in on because of our own advocacy and on a lot of other issues. And then advocate for easier pathways to permanent residence for those provided humanitarian parole, so that they're not just making the backlog even larger and have an unstable, insecure status in the meantime. So I will end with that and with some pictures. This is a refugee camp I've spent some time in on the left-hand side, where it's in the Afar region of Ethiopia, where some of the fighting has taken place domestically, as well as cross-border movements from Eritrea. And in that, the other picture is from a refugee camp on the Thai-Cambodian border in the 1980s. And I could show you pictures one after another of refugee camps that look like this in other parts of the world. So it's just to keep reminding ourselves that while we need to be worried about asylum and the border here and humane policies, the vast majority of people are in much, much worse situations where they are and where they've come from. So I'll end it at that. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. We will have questions at the end of the other presentation. So thank you for being with us today. I now want to welcome Esmeralda Flores. Esmeralda is a native of Tijuana and has an acute and multifaceted understanding of U.S.-Mexico border issues through personal and professional experiences and a complete overview of the needs and injustices that impact migrants at an individual and policy level. She is a co-founder of Al Otro Lado, a binational social justice legal service organization serving indigent deportees, immigrants, and asylum seekers in Tijuana, Mexico. For the past 4 years, she's been the immigrant rights and binational affairs advocate for the ACLU of San Diego Immigration Counties. And Esmeralda is a recipient of the Forward.us Keeping Families Together Champions Award for her efforts to reunite children and parents during the family separation crisis of 2018. Esmeralda is a graduate from Universidad Autónoma de Baja California School of Law, and she is now the South Regional Policy Manager with CHIRLA. So we are honored and pleased to have your perspectives, Esmeralda, as you present this. At the end, we will have questions, and I want to remind you to enter your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here this morning. Again, just a little bit about myself. My name is Esmeralda Flores. I was born and raised in Tijuana. I went to law school in Tijuana, and I actually worked at Coalición Pro Defensa del Migrante, which is a network of shelters in Tijuana and Mexicali, which are the border cities here with California. And after a few years of working there, I had the opportunity to move to San Diego to work for the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties. I was there for almost 8 years during the last part of the Obama administration, the entire Trump administration, and almost the first 2 years of the Biden administration. So it's been interesting to say the least. And as it was mentioned, I'm currently now at CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. It's an organization that does advocacy at the local, state, and federal level for around like immigration issues. And they're based in LA, but they recently started working at the border. So I joined them late last year as part of their team. And even before I start my presentation, I would also like to acknowledge that yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the creation of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. And yesterday and throughout the week, organizations will be doing a series of events and actions to highlight the damage that DHS has done to the immigrant community, mostly through the creation of Customs and Border Protection, the criminalization of immigrants, the unnecessary use of punitive detention, the militarization of the border, and the expansion of the physical border wall. So to get started, what is the border? I always like to share this map whenever I get a chance, just because I feel we have, people see the border as San Diego, El Paso, Calexico, and the border is much broader than that, according to the definition of the federal government and DHS. So according to them, the border is 100 miles from each external border of the country. So 100 miles from the border with Canada, 100 miles from the border with Mexico, and 100 miles from each of the coasts. So as you can see in the map, and it's laid out there, a lot of people in our country live in a border region without even knowing it. And what that means is that we don't only have the traditional immigration agencies, we don't only have ICE and ICE detention centers, we also have Border Patrol and Border Patrol stations throughout the red area that you see there. And while the border has always been a very special place, especially for me being born and raised here, it has gone through a lot of changes in the last few years. So when I first started working in immigration, the main issues that we were dealing when I was back at Casa del Migrante were really different, but at the same time a little bit similar. So we've always dealt with absurd violations to due process, but it was rarely in the context of the asylum process and at the scale that we're seeing now. Family separation has always existed too, but it was mostly a result of the deportation of one of the parents who have been living in the US for many years. They have an encounter with local law enforcement, and then they were transferred to immigration and deported. And that's how families were separated, because usually one of the parents was the one that was deported and the rest of the family would stay in the US. And it wasn't as intentional and a cruel policy to discourage families from seeking safety and protection. And then fast forward a few years later, the Trump administration came. And then we had like a series of border policies and practices that completely changed kind of like the landscape here at the border region. So we can start with immigration enforcement. So when Trump first took office, there was a fear in our community that immigration enforcement was going to ramp up. And we saw that during the first months by ICE conducting like large raids in workplaces throughout the country. So because of that, different organizations in San Diego created the San Diego Rapid Response Network, which was meant to be a hotline where people could call if they saw a raid happening, or if they saw immigration patrolling their communities, or even if immigration came to their door. That was how the San Diego Rapid Response Network was conceived back in 2018. And then we had the zero tolerance policy. It was implemented in April of 2018. It basically required for people who were crossing through the ports of entry and didn't have a way to adjust their status to be kind of like criminally prosecuted in that sense. It was rescinded under the Biden administration, but because of this policy, we saw what we saw with family separation in 2018. So the height of family separations occur during the spring and summer of 2018, but we know the effects are still ongoing. There was an investigation by the Government Accountability Office. They looked at records and data from Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, ICE and CBP. And according to CBP, the agency had separated at least 2,700 children between April of 2018 and May of 2019. That investigation also found that both CBP and ICE relied on inefficient manual tracking systems that were extremely prone to error. And in addition, emails and other Excel spreadsheets made it clear that there was no established system to manage the separations at all. The Biden administration created the Interagency Task Force on the Reunification of Families in 2021. And so far, the task force identified almost 4,000 children who were separated from their parents between July of 2017 and January of 2021. The task force in the latest report is aware that almost 400 children were returned to their home country, some with their parents, some without their parents, and almost 1,700 parents were returned to their home country. Again, some with their children, some without their children. And prior to the establishment of the task force, a little bit more over 2,000 children have been confirmed by the task force to have been reunited to their parents because of litigation that happened throughout 2018 and 2019. As of January 17 of this year, the task force has facilitated the additional reunification of almost 600 children with their parents in the United States. So another thing that happened at the same time was that ICE and DHS ended their safe release practice, which it meant that before releasing people from their custody, they were allowed to make contact with their family members or their support system in the US so they could travel safely to their final location within the country. That stopped in 2018, and that prompted street releases in San Diego in October of 2018. And because of that, the San Diego Rapid Response Network hotline received several calls about people being stranded at Greyhound stations or in random places in downtown. And we activated the system, and we, without knowing it, started a shelter in 2018. And because that policy didn't stop, and because of the numbers and the need that we saw here in San Diego, the San Diego Rapid Response Network went from being kind of like a hotline operator for Know Your Rights for people in San Diego to a shelter operator. And since October of 2018 until January of this year, the shelter has helped more than 130,000 people who have passed through San Diego in almost since 2018. And then after the family separation, we had the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP. There was also known as Remain in Mexico. In December of 2018, the Trump administration announced the creation of the program of MPP. And this program forced individuals who arrive at the southern border and ask for asylum, either at a port of entry or between ports of entry. They were taken into custody, given notices to appears or NTAs, and then they were sent back to Mexico, where they were instructed to wait and return to a specific port of entry at a specific time and date for the next court hearing. While MPP created like many due process related issues, and it was challenged in court multiple times, and unfortunately is not in place right now. I think one thing to highlight is it forced people to remain in the danger that they were coming from. And the US and Mexico failed to provide the appropriate resources, as well as international organizations that came to the border when that happened. So it created a lot of issues for the safety of people who were trying to access the United States for protection. And as you can see on the screen, according to human rights, there were at least a little bit over 1,500 documented cases of people who suffer rape, kidnapping, assault, and other crimes when they were sent back to wait under MPP. And then after MPP, we had Title 42. We had the pandemic that allowed the Trump administration to use a health order to basically close the border to immigrants. We know that over 1.8 million expulsions have carried out since the pandemic began. But however, nearly half of those expulsions were of the same people being apprehended and expelled back to Mexico multiple times. As reported by the American Immigration Council, this is because Title 42 has led to a significant increase in repeat crossings at the border. So approximately 1 in 3 apprehensions since Title 42 began have been of the same, it's been like the second or third attempt of the person to cross. Unfortunately, this is still in place. The Biden administration not only did it continue the program and using this policy to prevent asylum access, in part due to some like challenges in court, but it also unnecessarily expanded it to other nationalities that didn't apply under the Trump administration. And then I do want to flag that because of these two policies, because of the migrant protection protocols in Title 42, they have also separated countless more families by leaving immediate family members in different detention facilities, in different border cities, or even in different countries. So we know that thousands of families have been living in dangerous border camps or other precarious conditions because of the shelters just being overrun on the other side of the border. And some of the families have made like the really hard choice to send their children alone to cross and meet with family members on this side of the border because Title 42 does not apply to unaccompanied children. So sometimes parents would rather make sure their kids are safe without them than to try to gain some access as it has been closed by multiple policies. And also family separation is not just like parents and children. We also see family separation when it comes to non-parental caregivers. For example, grandparents that are coming with their grandchildren, aunts, uncles, or adult siblings with their minor siblings and are separated and classified as unaccompanied because there isn't this kind of like traditional link or like the nuclear family that the U.S. has defined. And then another thing that we have here at the border right now is the use of CBP-1. It's an application that people have to download in their phones. And that's the only way for them to access right now the Title 42 exemptions process. To also access the new parole system for Cubans, Haitian, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans that was announced earlier this year. And there have been a lot of concerns when it comes to the use of this technology. obviously limiting the access to the asylum process or the parole process for people who are tech savvy or that have a smartphone or that have reliable internet access to make it through the appointment. But putting that aside, just the technical difficulties that people have with CBP1, it was only released in English and Spanish. A Creole version was released almost a month later. There's still issues with the app when people try to use it, even if they choose the language of their preference. Sometimes the menus or the drop-down menus are still, or some of the instructions are still only in English. It's not compatible with older cell phones. There's not a desktop version, so people have to do it in their phones. They don't have the facility to do it in their computer with a bigger screen, with a bigger keyboard. There isn't a help desk or any source of troubleshooting mechanisms available to them by the U.S. government. A lot of organizations on the Mexican side of the border have stepped up and help people go through the intake, but none from like the government when it comes to that. And obviously we do have a lot of concerns when it comes to the privacy and uses of the data that they have been. And then the last thing that I will mention around CBP1 is that a lot of Black migrants have also had issues with the photo portion of the app because it fails to recognize. And then I'm not gonna get into details about the parole program that was created for the nationalities I mentioned previously, Cubans, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haitians. But I do want to flag that 20 states already sued the administration because of that parole that was created by the Biden administration. But those same states did not sue or didn't see any issues with the very similar parole program that it's based off, which is the United for Ukraine program. And then more recently, as you all probably heard, the Biden administration announced late January that it will end the COVID-19 emergency declarations on May 11. What this means for Title 42 is that by default, they think that Title 42 would end if there's no longer an emergency health order in place, public health order in place. So what we know so far is that all of like the legal challenges or pending cases that were in the courts, including the Supreme Court that was supposed to be heard yesterday, were suspended until we see what happens in May 11. And also I wanna highlight that some states have already expressed their intent to challenge that ending when it comes to time in May. At the same time that we have supposedly the potential end of Title 42 in May, the Biden administration through the DHS and the Department of Justice proposed a new rule to provide rule that we're calling the asylum tracing ban, because it basically will deem ineligible people to ask for asylum in the U.S. if they didn't apply for asylum in a country that they travel prior to accessing or getting into the U.S. This was a program that was tried, that the Trump administration tried to put in place. It was deemed illegal by our court system, and it's really disappointed to see this administration trying to implement the same illegal transit ban, arguing that is a little bit different just because it has some exceptions when it comes to it, and because it wouldn't be permanent, it would be a 2-year program. But as we know, with many of these processes and policies and practices that start as a temporary measure, they end up staying in here for the long run. And once they are implemented, it's really hard to get rid of them or to improve them in that sense. So that's the gist of the presentation. What can the League of Women Voters do? I think always being on the lookout and sign on to letters against right now the use of expedited removal, as Susan mentioned, the asylum transit ban, and other harmful policies that are being brought. Also submitting individual public comment against the asylum transit ban and issuing organizational statements and continuing engagement on social media. We also need congressional outreach, especially to encourage some of the members to issue statements and comments to administration. And again, as Susan mentioned, continue to educate ourselves and others about border issues and asylum issues, and follow trustworthy organizations on social media to keep up with actions and events that can facilitate all of this for you and for your friends and family. So I would leave it at that, and thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much, Esmeralda and Susan, for your sharing so much really important and excellent information today. It was nice to have both of your perspectives on the policies and help us to gain a little better understanding of that. At this point, we do have some questions, and I will start with the first question. Let me see here where I am. That's not it. I jumped over into my other box. Okay. Okay, the first question is a little bit different. It's the breaking news is about unaccompanied minors being used as illegal child labor in the U.S. factories and businesses. What tools does the government have to fix this and prevent it from happening in the future? Either one of you can answer that.
I can start, and I'm sure Esmeralda has ideas as well. I think that the Biden administration reacted very, very quickly to that New York Times article and has already put in place a proposed plan of action that involves much more enforcement at the work site. On that, the problem is that there aren't enough labor inspectors to be able to do that. And that's been a perennial problem within the migration field, because one of the problems with irregular migration, undocumented, unauthorized, is that people are much more vulnerable to being in these situations of terrible work conditions and low pay, et cetera. On that. So it's a good step forward to promise enhanced enforcement, but we have to actually have the capacity to do that. But I think that this is a really hard situation because many of these kids either have come specifically in order to work and send remittances back home because there's so little for their families, or are in a situation where, having come with the help of some smugglers, they owe the smugglers to large amounts of money and have to repay it. So just getting the kids out of the workforce isn't an answer for them. It doesn't deal at all with the poverty in El Salvador and Guatemala, or whatever countries that they're coming from. And so I think that we have to also be thinking much more seriously about what we can do to increase development, prosperity within the countries where people are coming, to deal with the violence in those countries. That's a long-term process. It's not going to help these kids immediately. But I think we also have to think about ways of providing funding, as we do in foster care, normally to the people who are in effect fostering the children, so that they have funding and they don't have to go to work in order to be able to fulfill their commitments to their families back home. it's a little bit different, as we don't want to give them money to give to the smugglers. We have to really ramp up the enforcement against smuggling, but we have to deal with the root cause of this, not just think that we can, do it at the end point.
Absolutely. Thank you. Did you have something, Esmeralda, to say?
Yeah, I would just add that sometimes this can also be a result of when we don't prioritize a family unit for some of the processes. As I mentioned in my presentation, while it seems humane to exempt children from some of the process, you put parents in these difficult positions of sending them alone. And then once they're alone, even though they might have like family, their family might be undocumented too. They might not want to go through the process with ORR or other government agencies. And that's when like this also can make it easier for children to be exploited and victims of other issues.
Thank you. Thank you both. Okay, the next question. Nonprofit organizations and faith-based groups have stepped up to help asylum seekers and others at the border. But this is a temporary solution in the absence of effective legislation or executive actions. What do you think is the best balance between private and government?
Yeah, that's a hard one in terms of trying to figure out the balance on it. But the refugee resettlement system, when it's working, not what happened to it after the Trump administration, was a great public-private partnership in which the federal government provided funds to faith-based organizations and others to receive refugees, help them resettle. It also provided funds to the states to help them have funding to provide services for the refugees that might not necessarily be available or needed by other populations. And there was a strong community process of involvement in order to help the refugees. So that's a model where I don't think we want to say either or. I think we really want to find that. And we're seeing it potentially happening again. The Biden administration did announce that sort of a pilot program of a private sponsorship system that would be very similar to the one that's run in Canada and that has been quite successful, in which there are small groups of individuals could be coming together and agree to put up the money to sponsor refugees. We could do this with asylum seekers as well. We can maybe even push the timing back so that it's not once they're approved as asylum seekers, but when they're first getting into the system where there is funding to help them get through it. They have the right to a lawyer, but not at government expense. We need to change that so that asylum seekers who are doing extremely difficult cases are able to pay for legal assistance. We could have, a public-private sponsorship and partnership for dealing with a lot of the issues that we're facing, and that would not solve the problem, but it would certainly, at a macro level, but it would certainly solve the problem for an awful lot of people who are without resources and don't have the financial ability to be able to get through the system as it's set up today.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just kind of share my experience. So in 2018, I was able to travel to Arizona and help with the reunification of families there. And that was kind of like a little bit of a coordinated effort between the government and nonprofits. And again, it wasn't perfect, but it worked. Just getting people out of the custody of the U.S. government makes a difference. And then most likely, because of that experience that I had in Arizona when the safe release policy ended, and we had the street releases in October of 2018, and we started the shelter without knowing it. We already kind of like knew what to do and what processes to put in place. So I think that the San Diego Rapid Response Network Migrant Shelter, the support that the state has poured into that effort, and other partners such as UCSD Medical, has been a great example of what a coordinated effort to truly welcome people in a humane and dignified way, without detention, with unnecessary detention. I'll say it again, detention is not necessary for people. And we can talk about the issues and the harms that detention has caused to the community at another time. But I repeat, I think that the San Diego Rapid Response Network shelter has been an example of what truly humane system of welcoming people can look like throughout the country. I don't think it's an issue of resource. I think the U.S. has the resource to put systems in place. I just don't think there's a will to do so. And then the San Diego Rapid Response Network, along with other organizations, put up a blueprint of what like welcoming people can look like, and I'll share that with the host so that they can share with participants too at a later time.
Thank you. Oh, that's my questions. Okay, this one was directed towards Susan. What does it mean that the U.S. did not endorse the original 1951 UN declaration, but did endorse the 1966 protocol expanding coverage?
Okay, I'll try to give a short answer. I put a longer one in the Q&A box, but first of all, it's the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, and that's important because a convention actually is legally binding on the states that ratify it. A declaration is not legally binding. So it was a convention, and it was pertained only to refugees in Europe and those who became refugees prior to 1951. So it was a fairly narrow convention at the time. The US had its own refugee resettlement program going on. We were admitting displaced persons through our own domestic legislation, and really saw no reason to be party to an international convention in this area. And most of you probably are aware that the US is very suspicious of conventions anyway. We've seen it in both both parties, although more so I think on the conservative end, but it's not an easy process. But anyway, moving forward, the 1967 protocol that was established to the convention took away the time limits in terms of pre-1951 and the geographic limits, and made it a universal document. And we had adopted in law a couple of years before that a provision for non-refoulement, the process that I mentioned in my speech, where a non-forcible return of people who would experience extreme harm if they were returned to their home country. So by then the 51 convention, as amended by the protocol, seemed okay to the US. And so we signed on to the protocol, but the protocol said that if you sign the protocol, you are accepting all the provisions of the convention. And so that's how we became parties to that convention, and are the most important country in terms of the UN process of protecting refugees. We give the most amount of money. We have been very good in many, many areas around the world, for example, in getting attention to the situation of refugee women. The US was out in front with Canada and a couple of the Scandinavian countries in recognizing gender-based persecution. And so it's been very useful having the US as a part of the refugee system internationally.
Thank you. Here's a question for Esmeralda. What more can be done to reunite the rest of the children with their parents? Any recommendations?
I think that's a very good question, and I think that's a question that will probably be better answered by the White House Task Force. As I mentioned during the presentation, unfortunately, there wasn't the appropriate systems to document the separation of families. So I know that that of the ones that we know have been separated, the task force has almost reunited almost 600 by now, which is great. But I think just bringing awareness that this task force exists through your network. So if they hear of families who were separated or are still being separated, they should let the task force know so they can take the appropriate action.
Thank you. If there are roughly 15 million displaced people in Central America, and our immigration quota for the US is 15,000, then is helping Central Americans in their country more important than taking in refugees, was the question.
Okay, I can start on that one. First of all, it shouldn't be an either or.
Right.
We need both. And we certainly need to increase the amount of aid going to the countries we're producing refugees, not just in Central America, but throughout the world. That means increasing the percent of our budget that goes into development aid and making sure that development aid is used effectively to deal with all of the reasons that people feel that they have to leave. And I, frankly, the work that I do on climate change and migration is showing that what we have now is just a small part of what we will have in the future as more and more people are unable to adapt in place to the effects of climate change, and we'll be looking for new places to go. So this is a really good time to put those mechanisms in place so that we've got them. In terms of the admissions of people, one of the things that I found as a government official, as well as a researcher, is that when the U.S. increases its resettlement commitments, it has tremendous effects on the willingness of other governments to increase their resettlement. And so every time we make any change, and we could be resettling so many more people than we are now, as we've seen with Ukraine and Afghanistan, we've brought in tens of thousands, over more than 100,000 people within a very short period of time, but using parole, not using the refugee resettlement system. So we can wrap up when we think it's an absolute necessity. We've had as many as 200,000 plus people resettled in a single year under the existing resettlement system. So it's doable, we can increase it. And it's a show also to the countries, if we're taking one out of 100,000 people, which, I'm just making up that ratio, it still shows the countries that have the majority of the refugees, usually next door to the place that's just exploded. But we show that we care. We're going to help them with their burden. And we're going to do it by providing funding, but we're also going to do it by sharing in a system by which we can bring people out who are particular need. And that may be the only solution for them. It's always going to be a small number of people who are resettled, but it can have a huge impact on the willingness to provide protection for others.
Okay. And a question for Esmeralda.
Oh, sorry. Can I add to that?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, of course. I think obviously, yes, addressing the causes of the root causes of migration, but also I think it's important to acknowledge or to highlight that, for example, when it comes to the experience of the San Diego Rapid Response Network shelter, 98% of the people that have gone through the shelter have a point of contact in the U.S. So they have a family member, they have a friend who can support them throughout the process. Doesn't mean they can take care of the person. Obviously, we still need like work permits and other things to make it easier for them to go through the process. Because as like Susan mentioned, this can take years. So we do need. So I want to highlight that they're not just coming with nothing. They usually have somewhere to go and somewhere to start, and continue through the process. I think we've seen that when our government wants, our government can make things happen. We did it for Ukraine. We created a parole system for them. We did it recently for other nationalities. At that point, CBP was able to process thousands of people a day for those processes. And then when we see Central Americans, when we see other nationalities coming, we don't see the same reception. We don't see the same facilities for them to apply. And then we don't see the same capacity at the border to process them. So I think there's obviously capacity to do and put systems in place that can welcome people in a humane and dignified way. We're just not doing them. And then also just, I know that immigration is usually thought of as just a federal issue, but we need to acknowledge that local governments need to step up. At the end of the day, they're gonna settle in your city, in your county, in your state. They're gonna be your neighbors. They're gonna be part of the workforce. They're gonna go to your schools. And the state and local governments needs to really work with the federal government and work with nonprofits to create the systems of welcoming people.
I hear you. And one of the questions actually had to do with what can the states do? And that question will be addressed, I think, during the advocacy portion of this presentation. Hopefully that it'll give more meat to that very issue. The other question that came for you, Esmeralda, is what do you see as the answer for the United States? An open border with no exceptions? Is that I'm not sure if that's the full question, but can you address that?
No, yeah, I think I would love to have an exact answer for that question. But I think, again, as we've seen, I think it's really important to highlight what has been working in the past few years. And I think this coordination with local governments between immigration and local nonprofits and other organizations that are willing to work and provide the resources for people to be able to travel to their final destination and continue their immigration case, whether that's asylum or another form of relief they might qualify for. It's really important. I think we should still keep pressuring whichever administration is in place to stop the criminalization and the vilification of immigration. That has been a great a barrier to getting support for this issue. I think when people see unaccompanied children, they really step up and they really feel the need to help. But when we see those same children in a family unit, for some reason, we think they're less deserving. So I think I would just say that there are already some examples of effective partnerships and effective ways of receiving people with humanity and dignity. And at the end of the day, is the government responsibility. But these partnerships with private and nonprofits have been working, and I think that's something that we should definitely be exploring and replicating in other regions, but also creating permanent infrastructure, because everything that we have now, it's not permanent. The spaces that we have right now for the shelter are not permanent. The funding is not permanent. So just making those investments permanent so that we are able to increase capacity and support folks.
Thank you both. I think that is the end of the questions and answers portion. And you've really enlightened us in so many different ways. It's overwhelming. I'm going to have to re-look at this recording myself just to catch up. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen. for orchestrating this whole thing for us today. It's a wonderful program, and thank you, Maureen, behind the scenes, for your help in sorting questions. And thank you to all of you who actually asked some questions. This was a really great program. I really want to thank Susan and Esmeralda for the work that you do and for offering this in-depth and fact-based perspective on the crisis at the border. We know that when dealing with the human condition, solutions are complex. They're not easy, or we would do them. I think all of us want to believe that everyone's heart is in the right place and would do the right thing for everyone. We know that, there are concerns of funding, concerns about, a change. I think, Esmeralda, you mentioned something that, these people will show up in our neighborhoods. They'll show up at the schools with our children and things like that. And really, including people and doing those things are very hard human things to do. But we need to see migrants as people and not a problem. Remember that in 1620, several people decided that the best move for them and their families was to embark on a long and perilous journey. The migrants of today are no different anywhere here in our border or globally, as Susan pointed out. I am a first generation sister, daughter, and granddaughter of migrants to this country. And I am so blessed that we didn't have these kinds of problems. There were jobs to be done, and there was workers willing to do the jobs. I don't know how many of you go through and see so many service level jobs left vacant because there just aren't enough people willing to do them. They have higher expectations for what kind of work they want to do. So there's a way to be able to fit people in as their processes go through the system. So I'm not suggesting open borders at all, but I'm saying that if people present themselves, they are people. And so we have to find a way to accommodate. And of course, it's a very self-serving thing. I associate so much with people at this level. So take it with a grain of salt. Before we move on, I want to express our hope that Ukraine is able to hold out against the Russian assault on their sovereignty. We all recognize that this war doesn't just threaten Europe, but is an attack on America's economic independence with Europe. We are so closely tied with them. It's essential to US national security and prosperity. So I really think that, we need to stand in solidarity with the Ukraine. I also want to express support for Congresswoman Judy Chu, who represents part of our service area and is a member of our league. We know that as a first Chinese American woman elected to Congress, she has been targeted for being a strong and dedicated representative of her community. So Judy, our heart goes out to you, what you're experiencing right now, so unjustified.
This is Catherine Gabsey. I've been your webinar host, but I am also an active league volunteer on immigration issues and advocacy. So I wanted to give you a quick rundown on what the league is actually doing and where we can have an effect and why we're doing this. As we all know, and we've been hearing, immigration, at least at the border, is primarily a national issue. The national federal government has control of the border, not the individual states. And so basically, League of Women Voters of the United States advocacy has been focused on recommending and trying to influence congressional and executive policies and programs. The League of Women Voters, as Karen told you earlier, adopted a position in 2009 on immigration. It hasn't been changed since, but it is a very strong and comprehensive position. We will be happy to share that with anybody who asks for it, but it's a position that enables us to do a lot of advocacy. and it has been used by the National League of Women Voters in the past, for example, to support DACA recipients via the DREAM Act, and to lobby for passage of the DREAM Act to support the DACA young people. The League has been actively, at the time that the family separation crisis was going on under the Trump administration, we were a voice to resolve that and get rid of that policy, and quite a few other things recently. In 2022, at the National League Convention, as Karen mentioned to you, there has been a growth in grassroots League membership concerned with immigration across the country, and wanting more energetic and focused action and advocacy by the National League on federal immigration policies. So at that convention, we got a resolution passed resoundingly from all the League delegates at the convention to say that we needed more action and that we would work with the National League on that and support them. So in order to do that, Hester, if we could move to the next slide, we formed a Google group, which is what everybody does these days, but there is an existing group called the Immigration Discussion Google Group. And its purpose is to get League members from across the country who are concerned with immigration as a national issue and policy to exchange ideas, information, support each other, talk about strategies for the League to learn about immigration issues. There are a lot of legalities, as you heard from both Susan and Esmeralda. We need to know them first before we speak, and to share ideas at the state and local level across the country, and to form a nationwide action team. And we also have really interesting meetings. We have speakers, informed and very motivating speakers like Susan, for example, come and speak to this group. If you're interested in learning more, we have at the bottom of this slide the 2 email addresses that you can use to request membership.
Well, I'll join in. This is Karen again, and I just wanted to sort of follow up with what Catherine is saying, that we really do have an immigration interest group in the California area, as well as the national interest group, the discussion group. So we do have people from various leagues that sign on approximately once a month and talk about what efforts, what's going to happen, you know, in each league with regard to immigration advocacy, and what can we do to help influence more improved immigration policies in the California state government. As Catherine, I think on one of the previous slides after she got frozen, California has done quite a few things for our immigrant population. We've talked about healthcare, we've talked about driver's licenses, we've talked about limiting the cooperation between law enforcement and ICE. We talked about access to in-state tuition. So those are just some of the things that California has done and that we would be supporting. But there's much more work to be done. And as an interest group, we can share some of the ideas that all of us have with regard to that.
Thank you very much for stepping in, Karen. I think we did get some technical difficulties. Anyway, I did want to thank you all for attending today and wanted to invite you to our next event, which is Thursday with the League. It's on May 4th at 10 a.m. again via webinar. And this time we're going to be talking about police practices. We have our subcommittee from our social justice group, the police practice subcommittee, and we're going to be presenting a program on recent developments in policing. There's been some new laws requiring some work that needs to be done on data collection, but by police agencies. And I'm sure that will be one of the topics that we cover, and let you know what kind of advocacy we've been doing in this area. So please be sure that next month sometime, you will see our bulletin up for registration for that webinar. So be on the lookout for that. And then if you have any questions about anything and you can't find it, make sure you contact our events committee at eventslw-pa.org. Don't forget that hyphen, because they'll end up in Pennsylvania if you don't put in the hyphen. Anyway, that's our event coming up. And then the next thing we want to do is invite you to join us, basically. We have a lot of great committees that put on a lot of our programs that get us out into the community and do a lot of work. Go forth and make a difference. Thank you.